Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hi, welcome to Elonomics. The week hasn't brought great news on the economy. The data for the first quarter GDP growth told us how badly the coronavirus pandemic and the lockdown has affected the Indian economy when we got to know that the economy has contracted by 23.9%. It's a historic low. Parallelly, there is a fierce and bitter fight going on between the center and the states on GST cess and the dues that the center owes the states. This is just the first quarter. What does it look like going forward in the remaining 9 months? How badly is the Indian economy going to be affected? And what are tax revenues going to look for the country this fiscal? We have Professor Ila Patnaik, talking about this week. That's what her column is also based on this week. Ila, the numbers, the forecast, the prognosis doesn't look good.
A lot of people have been talking about how to make it look good by spending more. So in this study, my co-author Rajeshwari Sengupta of the IGIDR in Bombay, NI, tried to make estimates of tax revenues. Our sense was that not only does the government have to spend more, and therefore there's going to be an increase in government borrowing because it has to spend more on its corona packages, but that there will be further challenges because of the shortfalls in tax revenue, and that they will fall by significant amounts. And it is necessary that we should have a realistic picture of tax revenues and what they are going to be like before we start talking about the government spending more and, stimulus packages and so on. So here what we did was to look at the basically GDP numbers. We took long-run averages and tried to look at, for the 5 main sources of taxes, what would these numbers look like. Our estimate actually suggests that they are not too far from the kind of data that has come out, though the data that has come out is only for GST. So earlier this week, data came out that GST was about 12% lower in August than it was in the previous August. So August 2020 data showed that GST collections were about 12% lower in 2020 August compared to 2019 August. And though we didn't have monthly data when we did this study finished it about a week or so ago, but we do have a very uncertain but somewhat realistic estimates of GDP, and based on that we try to see what would be the different sources of revenue and what might be the different different amounts of taxes collected through the main sources of tax collection. And broadly, to give you the summary right away, is that we expect that tax revenue collections in the full fiscal year would be about 12.5% lower than in last year.
You've gone about and broken up our tax revenues into 5 different taxes, the 5 main taxes that the government depends upon, which is corporation tax, income tax, goods and services tax, customs duties, and union excise duties. And you have, forecast a certain growth rate, and from the numbers, as people can make out, it's a contraction for all of them. So can you, very simply in a very macro way explain how these numbers have been arrived upon?
So let me start with the GDP forecast. Now, as you know, and we've discussed it in an earlier column as well, it is very, very difficult to forecast GDP this year. we are still in the middle of the year. The year has not ended, and we do not even know what the corona situation will be like. We don't know what the lockdowns will be like. We find that a number of, especially credit rating agencies, so economists as well as credit rating agencies like S&P, Fitch, and so on, have given a GDP estimate of -5%. Now, I'm underlining that this is not a very accurate forecast because there is a lot of uncertainty, and the uncertainty around this number is big. But it is a baseline scenario. It is something to start with. So we start with the real GDP forecast of -5% for the full financial year 2021, in which we assume that inflation is about 5. So we go above the inflation target of 4% because, we've seen supply constraints and and especially food and vegetable prices being a little bit higher this time. So we assume that is going to be fine. Now, what that gives us is a nominal GDP growth rate of 0%. In other words, for our lay reader, GDP, the value of goods and services produced, will be equal to what was produced last year. The output, production, consumption, it's the same as last year. That's basically the assumption, which, given the GDP, quarterly GDP forecast that came out, which you just mentioned, which is 23.9%, means we'll pick up a little bit more as the lockdown eases, not too much. And then by the end of the year, we shall be back at the levels of production which we had last year. So for the full year, it will not be low. So this is in some ways, this is an uncertain, this has a lot of uncertainty in it. It's not as if this is a very precise point estimate, but it's a good place to start because we do know that the economy contracted in the first quarter, and that it is slowly expanding, and that hopefully by 31st of March, we're, pretty much standing back on our feet. So that is the first most important assumption that is being made based on the estimates that we have from many other economists and our own intuition. The numbers that we have for corporate tax and income tax. So corporate tax is about 28% of GDP, of total gross tax revenue, and income tax is about 23% of gross tax revenue. And our projections for these are based on our GDP estimates. So the question you might like to ask is, so are we going to collect exactly corporate tax and income tax that we collected last year? And unfortunately, which is what makes this exercise a little complicated, the answer is no. Because even though we have these estimates, but when we start looking at corporate tax, we find that corporate tax depends on profits. And we look at profits of listed companies in India. And basically, the trends we are seeing is that profits might be lower by about 20% this year compared to last year. As you know, a lot of supply constraints, as well as work not being done and yet wages being paid, rents being paid. When the moratorium ends, businesses have to pay interest and so on. So, business is continuing, so profits will be lower and corporate profits will be therefore lower. And therefore, we make an estimate of what the corporate profits will be like based on the profits being 20% lower. Similarly, for others, like for example, for income tax, we base our estimates on what is the long-run ratio of income tax to GDP. And using that, we predict our income tax collections this year, which we believe will be a little lower than they were last year. So overall, though we are basing some of our estimates, like estimates for GST, on the GDP numbers, but it's not that we are keeping them at the same level as last year. We are basically saying that they'll revert to the long-term averages. So even if last year was a little better, if you collected X% of GDP as income tax, then you'll continue to do so. And then we put them all together.
But Ela, I mean, for a layperson, even that seems so optimistic, especially when you talk about just a 5% contraction for the full year GDP, considering how so many other economists and analysts, market analysts have after the first quarter numbers rushed to change their forecast and now say the economy will contract in double digits.
Well, I think the main purpose of the exercise was to point out that while a lot of people are talking about giving a fiscal stimulus, what they have not taken into consideration is what might tax revenues look like. And so we try to say that even in the most optimistic scenario, as you say, this sounds very optimistic. And I'm saying, yes, this is optimistic, that even in a very optimistic scenario, we are going to have a big decline in tax revenue. So, you already set out in the budget with a borrowing target of 30 lakh crore. Over and above that, you had an Atmanirbhar package. I don't want to go into how much of it was spent and how much not, and what is the actual, whether it's 4 lakh, 3 lakh crores, what is the actual borrowing that will happen. So we're not going into that, but we are saying that even that was challenging enough. It was a very challenging target. The tax revenue estimates in that were overestimated. We were expecting much more than last year's tax revenue collections. Now, our point is this, that even if things are not as bad as they might be, then also tax revenue is going to be pretty bad. And if tax revenue is going to be pretty bad, we need to be very, very careful when we talk about spending more. Mm-hmm. It's not just about saying, I get called a fiscal conservative, but it's not just about saying that I want to meet certain targets, but it's about saying, where are you going to borrow from? I mean, yes, household savings have increased a little because discretionary spending is not happening. Yet, can we say that people who did not, for example, get married did not have weddings in this lockdown period, will postpone their weddings forever? No. They will not. Maybe, yes, they may spend less, but a part of that money will get spent when things open up. So even if discretionary spending is lower now and savings have increased, but they're not going to increase by the full amount of what they have increased during the lockdown by. Mm-hmm. As a consequence, you're going to have difficulties borrowing from the domestic economy because your savings are not higher. You will have to think about where will you borrow from. It's very easy to say print money, but these very large numbers, printing money when you're at an inflation rate of say about 5% or so is not very feasible. Maybe you can do a bit of printing money, but not entirely fund the entire increase in deficit by printing money, nor can you borrow from abroad. So I think our main point is, let's get a realistic picture, even if a very optimistic picture of what tax revenues may look like, and then talk about how much should the government spend more, fiscal stimulus, when, how, etc. But not forget this part, that it's not just an increase in spending, it's not just the Atmanirbhar package or any other fiscal spending that the government has announced. There is a lot of borrowing that is going to happen because of the decline in tax revenue. That's the main point we are making.
Actually, that was supposed to be my next question on what are the implications of such a fall in tax revenue for the government, and you have already answered that. So I will try to expand on that, and we see this. We sort of touched upon this last week also. This conflict between the center and the states on how to borrow, where to borrow from, and who should borrow. Do you see more of these kind of situations arising in the remaining, say, 6 odd months of the financial year, or do you think it's going to be a much more smooth sailing when it comes to trying to figure out how to fill this gap in the fisc?
I think the stresses are going to increase because by now, given that these numbers are unfolding, so for example, given the kind of estimates we have, haven't really, are not out in the open, that what will be the revenue collection. There's no white paper by the central government or a re-estimated deficit target or a borrowing target. So slowly what's going to happen is, in my opinion, that there will be expenditure squeezing. And the government will have to, both at the level of the center and the level of the states, will have to tighten their belts. And once that happens, there's always this problem of who is going to spend less. So now we've seen this discussion about the compensation that center had to give to states, and it can't be given. I mean, even if, we had the old system, I mean, not to say that I wouldn't like to say that the states are in a better capacity to borrow than the center. No, they're not. We don't have a well-functioning bond market, and nobody's in a very good situation to borrow. But given that, if there had been a lockdown, then excise would also have been lower. So it's not that it is GST which is the cause of the lower tax collections. It is the lockdown and the corona that is a cause of the lower tax collections and the disruption to economic activity that has caused. When center and states have to cut down spending, salaries many times, we've seen in the past also that when there was a big tightening and a big crunch, then increments stop, hiring stops, all additional discretionary expenditure by government stops. Institutes like ours don't get funding, very often. That those are the kind of things that governments, which they don't see as very critical, essential expenditure, they try to cut down on those. And that does lead to a lot of stress in the system and to a lot of people. So I think that as these numbers come out, it is going to be difficult. There have to be ways in which the center and states cooperate. If we have conflicts for which no resolutions can be found, we'll only be in deeper trouble. So there have to be ways. They have to talk and sort out these problems, and they have to figure out how to keep the economy going and keep public finances of the center and states and keep the macroeconomic balance of the country stable. Because what you don't want is to borrow so much that your fiscal deficit spills over onto the external account and you have a balance of payment crisis. We mentioned this last time also, that there are countries who are now seeing, so we talked about South Africa, Turkey, Brazil, Colombia, that other emerging economies are seeing large government debt. They are seeing difficulties in financing this debt, and that these difficulties would, in principle, have implications for their credit ratings, for the balance of payments. And it is very odd that institutions like the IMF are saying that you can go about borrowing more and that you should be borrowing more. But I think we need to be more careful than even those who are typical fiscal conservatives. Because yes, we could have a balance of payment crisis. We could then turn to them. They would give us a loan, and that's all very fine. They are now perhaps going to give a loan to a lot of other countries as countries have crises. But for us, perhaps that's not something. They won't even be able to bail us out if we do have a crisis. So we need to be cautious. I'm not saying that we can do absolutely nothing. But I think a paper like ours, which is just, two independent economists trying to make an estimate, should actually be these sort of estimates should be coming from the ministry, the Ministry of Finance, from the CEA's office, that what are the revised budget estimates or targets for this year.
So we need to be cautious in managing and maintaining the macroeconomic stability of the Indian economy is going to be the challenge the Indian government, the Modi government will face in the coming months. Borrowing recklessly is not the answer. And I'm sure no one has the answer right now, and we will have to figure it out as we go along and manage the pandemic and the economy. Thank you for watching this episode of Economics. And we would like to thank all our viewers and readers who have taken subscriptions of the print. And if you have not done that, please do so. Go to theprint.in/subscriptions and please do pay for good journalism and come back to watch Economics again next week. Thank you very much.